Well, new data is out that shows no link between cell phone usage and cancer in kids and young adults. We are going to go for the surprising story to Gautam Naik in London. Gautam, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I was surprised by this, not surprised about how much kids are using cell phones because I see it all the time, but surprised that this study showed no link because we've been hearing reports that there is a possible link between cell phones and cancer.
You know, scientists have been studying this issue for about 2 decades, and I think there's no real conclusive evidence that cell phone usage can cause brain tumors or other major health effects. There have been sporadic instances in studies that suggest that there's a link. For example, there was a big 13-country research effort that found that average users or even heavy users didn't have a greater risk of getting brain tumors when they use cell phones. But if you're a really heavy user, there was a slight risk of getting a brain cancer. And there have been other efforts to try and come to the bottom of this. But with the explosion of cell phone use in children, most children seem to get their cell phones by age 9 or 10, and the simple biological fact that children's nervous systems are still developing when they're using cell phones, that cell phone radiation penetrates deeper into their brain, and some of their tissues actually absorbs twice the amount of cell phone radiation than an adult's brain would do. You put those two together, and it's been an obvious question: are children going to be more of a risk of getting brain tumors if they use cell phones? And this study, the answer seems to say no.
Is it possible, though, that what children are doing more is texting, that they're not actually holding the phones to their heads as often as adults are?
Actually, the explosion in texting is absolutely correct, but they're also using more the phones more for voice calls as well. At least some data I've looked at in Europe clearly suggests that while the texting use has really shot up, the use of a phone to make phone calls has also increased.
And David, I was surprised by how often kids are using the cell phones. Gautam, remind us, on average, how often does a kid or an adolescent use a cell phone?
Well, it's hard to tell, really, because if you're talking about a voice call, I think between different age groups, I think it was 12 to 30 minutes, at least in this study, from the 9 to 12 years old group, and considerably less, 4 to 8 minutes or something like that, in the younger group. But this is just from 4 countries in Europe, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Switzerland, and the numbers would vary depending on countries.
Yeah, Wendy, my daughter is not in Switzerland, but she is 9 years old, turning 9, and this is the issue for them right now. Am I going to get a cell phone? Some other kids are talking about it. It's not quite, pervasive, in her age group. But as a parent, I read this story. I read Gautam's story closely, and the one thing that bothered me about it was that in this particular study, there was sort of just a 4-year time horizon where they were looking for effects.
Very short,
and
right.
They couldn't say, whether or not some sort of long-term damage had been done just based on the period they looked at. So, it'll be interesting to see when these kids grow up and they do the follow-up, do they have a higher risk?
Because they're going to it's not like they're going to stop using them. They're now going to be using them until they're teens and through adulthood. Far longer than you and I will have.
Yeah.
And Gautam, I assume this is not going to be the last word on this. Are there other studies being conducted for similar periods of time and for similar groups such as children and adolescents?
Actually, this is the first study that's actually specifically looked at possible brain cancer effects from cell phone use in children. So it's the first word, by no means the last word. There are already a couple of big studies underway, at least in Europe. I'm sure there are other underway in the US as well. But there's one thing I do want to say, and that's for any concerned parent out there. There's a very simple fix. Just make sure that your child uses a hands-free kit or at least an earpiece with a cell phone, and you dramatically will lower any potential risk of brain tumors or any other health effects from your cell phone.
And Gautam, quickly before we go, is there any evidence, you say use the headset, but then I think there are people who worry about the cell phone being in their pocket or close to other organs. Has there been any studies about that and whether the cell phone can affect you in those areas if you're just holding on to it, even if you are using a headset?
Well, there have been a lot of animal studies, and the question is whether the radiation emitted by a cell phone can actually damage DNA. And these animal studies have shown that it cannot, because the kind of radiation a cell phone emits is called non-ionizing radiation. It's the same kind of radiation, say, that you get from light waves. And so it has a lower risk factor for that reason. So having a phone vibrating in your pocket and it actually having the radiation penetrate and affect your DNA, at least as of the science now, seems to suggest the chances are low.
All right, Gautam, thank you for that fascinating story, which is in the Journal and online today.
Wendy, you know I play Angry Birds, and I can tell you that that is a far greater risk to your life.
I can tell.
It will ruin your life.
I think your Twitter avatar is an Angry Bird, is that right?
Well, it's taken over. What
it
can I
is.
do?
It's all over. All right.